So, welcome back to International School History Teacher. In this lesson, I want to look at post-World War II decolonisation and the independence movements that emerged at that time. Now, I'm going to be using this diagram, this Prezi, to help explain the most important themes, and you can download a blank version of this diagram in the lesson description just below here. Now, you can complete that, if you like, as the lesson progresses. I'll begin by briefly looking at decolonisation before 1945 and then the three types of decolonisation that are often identified in the textbooks. That's violent, negotiated and accelerated. This will be followed by a review of the different reasons for the types of decolonisation, which we can separate into external factors and internal factors. By the end of this lesson, you should have a clearer understanding of not only how decolonisation happened after 1945, but also why it happened, and why it happened the way it did, and when it did. The first thing we need to understand is what was going on before 1945. Now, this map provides us with a good starting point. We can see in the different colours the imperial powers in Africa and Asia in the period before 1945, the Dutch, the British, the French, etc. In grey, we can see how few states had attained independence at this time: South Africa and Abyssinia, Ethiopia as it is today, and Egypt. We can see the dates of independence as well. Many of those dates, you'll notice, are from the 1960s. Let's get some definitions out of the way. Decolonisation is the process by which dependent countries, colonies, become independent of a colonial or imperial power. Decolonisation might be said to have begun, I suppose, with the American Revolution in the 18th century, and this continued in the 19th with the decline of the Spanish Empire in the Americas and the Ottoman Empire in Europe. This led notably to Greek independence and Serbian independence during that century. A key turning point in the history of decolonisation was the First World War, and in particular the Paris Peace Conference that followed it. The American president, Woodrow Wilson, and his principle of self-determination, of people controlling nations and their political destiny, was one of the key principles of his famous 14 points. But he also spoke explicitly of the need to be concerned with colonies and the interests of the populations concerned. This was reinforced with Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. This new international organisation was concerned with what it called the sacred trust of civilization for the well-being and development of colonial peoples. Perhaps even more significant was the presence in Paris of the colonial peoples themselves. The first Pan-African Congress, funded by the US National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, was given permission to meet in Paris by President Clemenceau himself. The group's major demand was to end colonial rule and racial discrimination. It stood against imperialism and it demanded human rights and equality of economic opportunity. Now, one of my favourite images from Versailles in 1919 is of this pastry chef. Ho Chi Minh, later leader of an independent Vietnam, was in Paris at the time to campaign for the rights of the subject peoples of Indochina, and he wrote this letter to the US Secretary of State, hoping he would recognise, and I quote, "the sacred right of all peoples to decide their own destiny." In 1919, the answer was no. The nature of decolonisation after 1945, for example, whether the process was violent or peaceful, or whether it was fast or slow, often reflected what had been going on internally within the empire before 1945. One of the first political independence movements, the Indian National Congress, was founded as early as 1885, and power had gradually shifted away from British direct rule through a series of landmarks, which culminated in the Government of India Act in 1935. In the Dutch East Indies, Sarakat Islam became the first large-scale nationalist organisation campaigning for political independence in the region. The first party congress was held in Surabaya even before the First World War. Moving on now to look at the nature of decolonisation, we can outline the traditional French textbook classification of three forms of decolonisation, that is, violent, negotiated and accelerated. And from there we can move on to look at some of the possible reasons for the differences. Violent decolonisation is characterised by the physical clash between the colonial power and the independence movements. This was the case in Indonesia, in French Indochina, Algeria and in Kenya. In negotiated decolonisation, we're looking at independence movements that achieve their aims through a series of diplomatic negotiated stages. This includes the example of India, Tunisia, Ghana and Tanzania. And finally we have the example of accelerated decolonisation. If you remember the map with which we began this film, we saw that many countries, especially in Africa, attained independence during the 1960s. This decolonisation happened very quickly after the Suez Crisis and the war in Algeria. So returning to our diagram, we now move on to look at the all-important factors that help explain the how and when of decolonisation and the reasons why the nature of decolonisation varied from one country to the next. I've separated these factors into internal and external factors, which is something examiners are keen to ask students to consider. An external factor of decolonisation refers to something that encouraged or made possible the process of decolonisation, a factor that was relatively independent of either the coloniser or the colonised. Often an external factor provided a context that might enable or hinder the process of decolonisation. External factors often explain when and why decolonisation happens, and this becomes clear when we look at some of the examples of what I mean. The first example is the Second World War. This was clearly an important external factor. The defeat and occupation of European colonial powers such as France and the Netherlands provided anti-colonial liberation movements with an opportunity to assert their independence and to fine-tune their political and military tactics, often against the new occupying power, Japan. After the war, European colonial powers struggled to maintain their global influence because of the economic problems they faced. In an age of post-war austerity and international debt, Britain and other European powers often lacked the political resolve to maintain the economic burden of maintaining an empire. Thirdly, the success of the Indian independence movement helped create an anti-colonial climate of international opinion and a domino effect as countries successfully asserted their independence and inspired others to follow them. The new global world order of the Cold War saw a world dominated by two superpowers defined by their opposition to European colonialism. This was made painfully clear to Britain and France in 1956 when they tried to maintain their control over the Suez Canal. The Egyptian leader Nasser was able to defy the colonial powers because the Soviet Union and the USA forced Britain and France to withdraw. Which brings us to the final external factor, the United Nations, which led the political pressure against Britain and France and supplied the peacekeeping troops that policed the post-crisis Israeli-Egyptian border. The UN was founded on the principles outlined in the Atlantic Charter of 1941. In the words of the historian Caroline Elkins, the independence genie was out of the bottle, and it was the Atlantic Charter that had set her free. The third common principle of the Charter stated that it is the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live. So returning to the diagram, in addition to the 5 external factors, we can also identify 4 internal factors, which in particular help to explain the nature of the decolonisation process. An internal factor of decolonisation refers to something that encouraged the process of decolonisation that can be explained by events inside the colony itself or within the relationship between the colony and the coloniser. If external factors tend to explain when and why colonies become independent, internal factors explain the nature of that decolonisation, whether the process is likely to be peaceful or violent, for example. The first important internal factor derives from the way in which the colony has historically been governed. Now, this is something we looked at when we studied the subject of new imperialism. We spoke of three political types of imperialism. We spoke about colonies, and they can be divided between colonies that have direct rule, where officials and soldiers are sent to administer the colonies directly. This is typically the French model. And then you have indirect rule, typically British, where rule takes place with a cooperation with local sultans and chiefs, etc. They've often become typically westernized, and that obviously, as I've said, is typically the British model. You have protectorates also, which are basically with local rulers left in place, but obviously following the advice of their European advisors. And then finally, spheres of influence, areas outside, obviously, of the direct control, but expecting exclusive investment or trading privileges to be maintained with the European or American powers. Examples there of China and Latin America. The nature of previous colonial rule, therefore, makes a significant difference. If an effective political state has been developed with the modern infrastructure you would expect, if it has the support and integration of the local elite, then the process of decolonization or independence might be smoother because the local population has the experience to run a modern state. But if the state has largely been controlled through imported administrators and significant numbers of European settlers, then the transition tends to be rather more difficult as Europeans resist the loss of their colonial status. Now again, we need to look at some examples to make sense of this. If we look at West Africa, we have the example of Ghana, which as part of the British Empire was known as the Gold Coast. For historic and economic reasons, there were very few European settlers in the Gold Coast, and governments followed the usual British pattern of indirect rule. This made it easy for Britain to leave, which they did in the face of the non-violent protests of the Nkrumah-led independence movement. In contrast, in East Africa, Kenya was a colony which had been used by the British to allocate farming land to thousands of former soldiers who had served during the First World War. Now, these soldiers had to be white, and a high percentage were drawn from the upper classes. The violent Mau Mau anti-colonial movement was motivated by a range of factors, but these included land dispossession, political and economic marginalisation that had resulted from this European settlement. The nature of British rule had made decolonisation much more difficult to negotiate peacefully. A second related internal factor is the attitude of the colonial power to the question of independence. An election outcome or a change in government personnel can result in an imperial government more willing to negotiate independence. The 1945 election defeat of Churchill's Conservatives and the coming to power of a Labour government committed to Indian decolonisation clearly contributed to India becoming independent in 1947. But sometimes it's not the change in personnel that matters, but rather the change in attitude of that personnel. In 1945, de Gaulle had been a strong advocate for maintaining France's colonial empire. He was committed to upholding France's colonial status in Indochina, but by the time he made his famous speech in Brazzaville in 1958, his attitude to decolonisation had changed entirely. By this point, he was much more willing to accept decolonisation. A third key internal factor is the level of socioeconomic development of the colonies themselves. A growing middle class, high levels of literacy, a civic, perhaps national culture, and the existence of mass media are all indicators that a genuinely popular independence movement might be created. For example, the significant growth in literacy in India in the years before the Second World War allowed for greater awareness and understanding of the impact of colonialism, as well as a greater ability to organise and advocate for decolonisation. The final internal factor is the existence of an organised popular movement or political party dedicated to the goal of independence itself. Organisations such as the Congress Party in India, the Convention People's Party in Ghana, or the National Liberation Front in Algeria campaigned, often illegally, for the creation of a state independent of colonial influence. Without well-organised revolutionaries, revolutions are much less likely to be successful. So that is how the internal factors, along with the external factors, help to explain why, how, and when decolonisation happened in Africa and Asia after 1945. Thanks for watching. Architecture.
mysterious architect.